evening, guys. Sorry, I'm currently gathering my confidence. Putting some lotion on my hands. And just trying to trying to keep my composure. I didn't come so fast. That is not something I want to hear at the start of this. Okay. Welcome, guys. So this is gonna be the first read stream. We are gonna be reading the Seventh Tower, volumes. Well, for tonight, it's only gonna be part of Volume 1, and I'm gonna keep that as the same. I'm gonna be keeping that as the same title until we're done with Volume 1 of Volume 1 through 3. Anyways, welcome in Solo, welcome in John, welcome in Big Smart, welcome in Diane. Hi, I hope your evening's going well. Start us off with some earbuds for now. Okay. We have our fireplace, and we have our book. So, I'm gonna be starting up the okay. Let me move forward a bit. Okay. So we have wires everywhere. Give me a moment. To get everything out of the way. Some of those ear rubs in there. While I'm still gathering my own confidence. Okay. Alright, so let's start recording for YouTube. So this is gonna be first one. So how this is gonna work is between chapters I will read. I'm doing okay, but my anxiety is way up here. Like but I'm doing okay. So how this is gonna work is between chapters I'll read any notifications and stuff. Currently the headphones are turned off so you guys can't hear anything, only I can. So please try to chill it. If you can wait on anything that you want to do, wait till after the chapter. Between chapters, I'm gonna turn off and on the record for each chapter, and then I'm gonna upload them to YouTube as separate videos later down the line. Alright? Sound good? Sound good, guys? Yeah? Okay. So let's start recording. Alrighty. So tonight we're going to be reading The Seventh Tower, Volume 1 by Garth Nix. And apologies if sometimes I run out of breath. I am incredibly nervous. The author's note at the start says, "To my family and friends, with a particular thank you to David Lefithan, a very important architect in the building of the Seventh Tower." Chapter 0. Tal stretched out his hand and pulled himself up onto the next outthrust spike of the tower. He stopped there to get his breath and looked down the red tower, down to the twinkling lights that outlined the main buildings of the castle. They were far below, a height that made Tal dizzy. He quickly looked back up. The wind was much stronger than Tal had expected. It howled around the red tower, and then spun through the other 6 towers, before coming back at him even stronger than before. It was also getting colder, making the climb even more difficult. Tal's sunstone kept the worst of the chill at bay. It had taken Tal 2 hours to climb to his current resting place, a hard climb up through the spikes, gargoyles, and encrustations that covered the tower. Now he was only 4 stretches below the point where the tower appeared to suddenly end, meeting the lid of total blackness that lay across the sky. This was the veil. The strange barrier that kept the whole world in darkness, turning back the light of the sun. Not that it was completely dark around Tal. Like most of the castle, the red tower was lit with small sunstones fixed into the walls and ceilings. The light from those sunstones spilled out the windows, so Tal could see where to climb. The other 6 towers blazed with light, too, brilliant shafts crisscrossing the sky. The light made many shadows flicker outside. Every gargoyle and decorative flange cast a shadow, dark against the ochre red of the tower. There was Tal's own shadow, too. Like all the chosen of the castle, Tal's shadow did not echo the shape of his body. The shadow that moved with him flowed and changed. Sometimes it had the general shape of a 13-year-old boy. Sometimes it looked like a cat, or a 2-headed corvail, or something so fluid it was indescribable. For Tal's shadow was not the one he had been born with. It was a shadow guard, a magical being from the spirit realm of Aenir. It had been bound to Tal when he was born, replacing his natural shadow, and was commanded to guard and help him. This was just as well, Tal thought. It's bad enough seeing his gangly limbs and scraggly hair in the mirror. He was relieved not to have a shadow of them following him around. The shadow guard didn't show that Tal was shorter than most of the other boys his age, or his slightly crooked smile that he thought made him look a bit slow. No one else did, but it mattered to Tal. He'd practiced smiling in the mirror for hours, trying to straighten that curl on the left-hand side. He didn't mind that the shadow guard was only one of the weakest spirits from Aenir, a child servant. When Tal turned 13 3/4 in 2 months' time, he would enter Aenir himself and bind a real spirit shadow to serve him. If he was able to enter Aenir, Tal clutched the small sunstone on the silver chain around his neck, feeling its warmth enter his chilled hands. To enter Aenir, he needed a primary sunstone, not just for himself, but also for his mother and for his younger brother and sister. Since his mother was very sick and his father and their mother and their family's sunstone had disappeared mysteriously, it suddenly become Tal's responsibility to look after the family. He wasn't prepared for this, but he didn't have a choice. He had to push his fear deep inside himself and keep it there. He had to be strong, even if he didn't know where to find that strength. He wanted his father back. He wanted his mother well. But both would be lost to him forever if he failed now. In order to save his family, he had to get a new sunstone, a powerful one, not a child's stone he wore at his throat. Tal drew a deep breath and slipped the stone back under his shirt. He had to climb farther, past the veil, out into the full sunlight. He'd seen the sunlight before, of course. He'd seen it many times in Aenir, the spirit world, but it was softer there, less bright. Tal had only seen the true sun once, when he was 10. His class was taken up beyond the veil and shown the sunstones growing in silver nets that hung from the towers. It had been overcast, but even then, all the children had needed their shadow guards to cloak their eyes. Sunstones might capture the light of the sun, but even the most powerful could not compare to its strength and brilliance. Back then, they'd climbed up the stairs inside the Orange Tower. Tal had never thought that one day he would be climbing outside of one of the towers to steal a sunstone. To steal a sunstone, he repeated to himself. It was the last resort, the only thing he could think of that would save him and his family. He tried everything else. It was also the riskiest thing he could imagine. It was a hard climb just to get where he was. But that was nothing. On the other side of the veil, there would be guards and traps. Powerful spirit shadows that could chew up his shadow guard in a second and capture Tal. There could even be one other chosen, members of the Red Order, who would be only too pleased to catch a boy of the rival Orange Order. It would be the Hall of Nightmares for him then, or worse, and disaster for the family. Tal shook his head and started to climb again. He reached a gargoyle just below the veil and, almost against his will, crouched down to delay reaching the darkness that brooded above his head. It was almost like being underwater and looking up, thought Tal, except in the darkness rather than light. Finally, he stretched his hand up into the veil and shivered as it disappeared. But he could still feel it. It was still there. Tal stood up. Instantly, he was caught in total darkness. He started to breathe hard, his lungs seeming to shrivel. He couldn't get enough air. The darkness was sucking the air out of him. He ducked back into the comfortable twilight and the bright beams from the towers. His hand clutched around his now blazing sunstone. Tal quickly focused upon it, and the light dimmed. He didn't want to attract attention. Only a moment after his sunstone dimmed, a faint cry echoed up from below. For a second, Tal thought he'd been discovered, and he shrank back against the tower wall. Then he realized it hadn't been the shout of a guard or the high-pitched, inhuman scream of a spirit shadow. It sounded more like a cry for help. It came again, and Tal felt his stomach go hollow and strange. He knew that voice. Quickly, he looked down. There, a good 200 stretches below, was the flicker of a white shirt touched with orange. It was the same sort of shirt that Tal wore, a child's uniform of white, the collar and cuffs bearing the color of his order. Someone had followed him. It had to be his younger brother, Gref, a 9-year-old desperado who tried to do everything his older brother did. Tal recognized the voice and the small, feeble sunstone. "If you touch me, Tal will blast you into bits. Get away, get—" Gref's voice was suddenly cut off. For an instant, Tal thought his brother had fallen, and his own heart seemed to stop. But Gref hadn't fallen. He had been picked up by a huge spirit shadow, one with the flickering shape of a borzog, a creature long extinct in the flesh. It was easily 4 stretches tall and enormously broad-shouldered. Its arms trailed below its knees, and the 2 tusks in its lower jaw were the size of Tal's hands. In the light from the tower, it rippled in shades of darkness, a thing of soft edges and blurred lines. It had Gref under one arm, and it pulled Gref's shadow guard over his face like a gag. There was no sign of the chosen the spirit shadow was bound to, but whoever it served was taking Gref back down the tower, probably to the balcony far below, where Tal had started his climb. Tal hesitated. He wanted to rescue Graf, but he knew he'd just get caught as well. That wouldn't help either of them, or the family. As before, his only chance lay upward, with the Sunstones. Tal faced the veil once more. He'd made a mistake going into it slowly before. This time, the thing to do was to reach up, get a handhold, and climb through as quickly as possible. He took several deep breaths and stood up fast, with his hands outstretched above his head. His knuckles grazed stone, and then he felt something he could hold on to. A moment later, his head entered the veil. Once again, there was total darkness. But now, Tal was prepared for it. He pulled himself up onto the next gargoyle and thrust his hand up for another handhold. He found one, climbed again, and then repeated the process. He still hadn't come out of the veil, and his breath was going. Hesitantly, he took a small breath. It worked, but his fear of not being able to breathe was soon replaced by another terror. What if he was lost in the veil? Maybe it was impossible to climb through it, except inside one of the towers. Maybe he was trapped inside the veil forever. He climbed faster, not caring that his hands were scratched and his knees bruised. Several times, he almost fell, but even that didn't scare him as much as staying inside the veil. He had to get out. Suddenly, he broke out into the exact opposite of darkness. Tal screamed as the searing light of the sun hit his eyes. Again, he almost fell, but his shadow guard was already weaving itself across his head, shading his eyes with its strange substance that could be as light as air, as flowing as water, or as solid as human flesh. Tal hung on, half in the veil, half out, as the burning slowly disappeared from his eyes. He could feel his shadow guard on his forehead, and the unfamiliar heat of the sun on his cheeks. Slowly, Tal opened his eyes and looked around. There was a patch of blue sky directly above him, strange and unfriendly compared to the soft darkness of the sky under the veil. Around this patch of blue there were puffy gray clouds, some already drifting down through the veil, bringing a promise of snow. Right in the center of the blue was the sun, so bright he could not look directly at it. It felt dangerous, giving up so much light and heat that Tal felt as if he might suddenly burst into flame. The red tower, like all the others, continued to soar up into the sky, but now, instead of the gargoyles and spikes and carvings, the tower walls were covered in long, protruding bronze rods, as thick as Tal's middle. Most of the rods had nets of silver mesh hanging from them, and in those nets there were sunstones. Tal knew that sunstones grew from small jewels brought back from Aenir, the spirit realm, but he had not yet been taught how they were prepared. Tal didn't want to know either. Not now. All he wanted to do was climb up farther, because the most powerful stones would be higher up. Slowly, he eased himself out of the veil and crouched in the stone ledge, staying as close to the wall as possible. He couldn't see any spirit shadows or other chosen. There was a half balcony farther up, though, and someone could easily be standing there, or on the walkway that went right around the top of the tower, 100 stretches above him. Shadow guard, weave me a cloak as red as the tower, Tal whispered. At the same time, he concentrated on his sunstone, so it shone with the same red color as the tower walls. He felt the shadow guard moving, and saw as a long, thin finger of darkness stretch across and touch the stone. Instantly, the color of the stone bled into the shadow, until it was red as well. Then Tal felt the shadow guard spreading itself across his back and down to his ankles. In a few seconds, Tal was covered in a hooded cloak, exactly the same red as the tower walls. As long as he climbed up slowly and didn't make too much noise, he would be almost invisible. Carefully, he started to climb. The bronze rods were slippery, not as easy to grasp as the stone outcrops below, but they were closer together. Tal could use them like steps, moving around the tower as he climbed. He was almost to the balcony when he looked up and saw a hideous head staring over the railing directly at him. It was a spirit shadow head, grotesque and scary, with multiple eyes and mouth that stretched the full width of its face, lined with multiple rows of small but very sharp teeth. It was one of the largest spirit shadows Tal had ever seen. This meant it was one of the most powerful, far too powerful to be in the service of one of the red, for they were the weakest of the orders. Tal froze, hoping it hadn't seen him. He stayed frozen for what seemed like minutes. Clouds crossed the sun overhead, and suddenly it was much darker, making the spirit shadow harder to see. Tal kept absolutely still, hardly breathing. His heart sounded loud, so loud he was sure the spirit shadow heard it. Then it started to snow. Snowflakes began to drift down, only to be caught by the wind around the towers and whipped sideways in sudden flurries. Tal knew what snow was. He'd seen it many times through the triple glazed windows of the outer walk, but he'd never been outside the castle before. He'd never felt snow. A snowflake landed on Tal's nose, cold and then suddenly wet. He sneezed. The spirit shadow up above hissed and leaned over the rail. Tal held his breath, but it was too late. It had seen him. It leaned over still farther, revealing a body like a snake's, all long, smooth, and twisting. For a second, Tal thought it was going to fall over, but the spirit shadow slowly uncoiled down toward him. Its eyes, black points darker than the rest of its shadow flesh, were firmly fixed on him. Tal fought the feeling that it would capture him, and he would be taken before the Luminor of the Red, and then to the Hall of Nightmares. He would never again a primary sunstone, and would all too soon be cast down to join the ranks of the Underfolk. From there, he would be unable to help his mother, or Graf, or Kusi. The spirit shadow didn't try to grab him, though. It suddenly shot forward, and its toothy maw opened large enough to take Tal's head off in a single bite. Tal's shadow guard pushed him over as the spirit shadow struck. Despite his shock, Tal instinctively grabbed a rod and locked his legs around it. Upside down, Tal stared up as the creature pulled itself back for another strike. His own shadow guard was letting out a shrill whistle, its warning sign, as it turned itself into a boy-sized shadow and pushed Tal away. Tal pulled himself out along the bronze rod toward the sunstone nets. He couldn't believe what was happening. Spirit shadows couldn't hurt one of the chosen. The spirit shadow laughed, a horrible, high-pitched cackle that cut through Tal's shock and made him swing himself upright and move farther along the rod. Then the spirit shadow spoke, scaring Tal even more. Spirit shadows could speak, unlike the shadow guards, but they never did so in public. They only spoke to their masters in private. "Seek not the traverse of the sun," said the spirit shadow, its voice like fingernails dragged down stone. "I am the keeper, and none may pass here save those who know the words." Birds? Muttered Tal as he frantically tried to get farther away. He didn't know any words, not ones that might work here. He'd never heard of the keeper. Surely its master would look over the balcony soon and stop it. The spirit shadow coiled itself completely around the other end of the bronze rod that Tal was sliding on. Tal's shadow guard balanced behind him in the shape of a four-legged creature with claws and lots of teeth. It would try to guard him, but Tal knew it was too small and weak to slow the spirit shadow for more than a few seconds. Tal looked back at it and felt the panic rise in him again. The snake spirit shadow shrieked and slowly wound itself forward another stretch. It seemed in no hurry to get to Tal, though its mouth was working backward and forward, almost as if it were chewing. "Help!" screamed Tal, his open mouth collecting a few snowflakes. He didn't care who came now, or how long he might be sentenced to spend in the Hall of Nightmares, or if he would be instantly demoted to the Underfolk. Anything would be better than facing the creature that was inching toward him. "Help!" "The towers are silent, save for thee and me," said the spirit shadow. It arched its long body forward in a sudden movement that sent Tal leaping forward into one of the nets. Frantically, he tried to stand up, but all he could do was roll around. One of his feet broke through the mesh and caught fast, sending a small shower of sunstones falling through the hole. Tal bent forward and tried to free his foot, ignoring the sunstones that were everywhere around him. He'd just gotten it free when the spirit shadow struck. Tal flinched and gasped, but he was not the target. His shadow guard squealed as the thing's mouth closed on it. Instantly, it lost its cat shape and began to change shape so quickly that Tal couldn't keep track. It was a Morlix, a boy, a Toppet, a bird-headed monster, all sorts of shapes and sizes. No matter what it changed into, it couldn't get free of those terrible teeth and the grinding jaws. Finally, the spirit shadow tossed it aside, and it hung off the net, a formless lump of shadow. Tal bit back a sob. His shadow guard had always been with him, always at his heels. It saved him from troubles both large and small. Now it had been destroyed in a few seconds. He couldn't believe this was happening. Spirit shadows didn't damage shadow guards. They couldn't hurt the chosen, unless, he thought suddenly, all the rules were different beyond the veil. "I shall eat both shadow and flesh," said the spirit shadow, as it reared back and lifted its head high above Tal. Snow whirled behind it like a cloak of white. Tal could see inside its huge mouth, see all the rows of teeth. There were strips of cloth and other things stuck in the teeth, accompanied by an awful, rotting smell. In that moment, Tal realized that this thing had killed before. It was going to kill him too. It did not matter that he was one of the chosen of the castle, a Lightbringer of the Orange Order, a potential Shadow Master. As the thing struck, Tal threw himself aside and out of the net. Falling, he hit a net on the second level below. For the briefest second, Tal thought he was safe. Then he bounced out in a shower of sunstones, out into the air, too far out to be caught in the nets below. Tal saw the tower spinning above him as he hurtled down, along with the snow clouds and the whirl of snow and sunstones that fell with him. The wind picked everything up, boy and snow and sunstones, and blew them farther away and farther out, beyond any chance of being caught in the lower nets. When he hit the veil, everything went black. His mind, overloaded with fear, went black too. He had only an instant before he became unconscious, time enough to break through the veil and see the twinkling lights of the castle, so far below, in time to think a single thought. Why did I ever try to steal a sunstone? And that is the end of chapter 0. Next chapter, part 1, Before. Chapter 1, Before. Tao's search for a new sunstone began the day his father disappeared. 8 days later, this search would lead him to the Red Tower, the nets, and the terrible Spirit Shadow. His whole life as a chosen had been transformed. One otherwise ordinary day, when he'd been called out of the lectorium during a lesson and told by Lector Rome himself the fateful words, "Your father is missing, believed to be dead." Tal had initially fought back tears, but they came freely as he ran through the bright corridors and down the orange stair to his family's residence. He tried to wipe them away as he ran, ignoring the stares of other chosen of the Orange Order and the sideways glances of the Onderfolk. It could not be true. Tal wouldn't believe his father was dead. He was missing, but that wasn't the same thing. Lector Rome hadn't been able to give Tal any details. All that was known was that Reram hadn't returned from a mission from the Empress down in the deep caves beneath the castle. He could be lost down there, Tal thought, imagining his solid, powerful father stranded in the darkness. But he would find his way back. He loved Tal, his brother and sister, and their mother too much to leave them. He was too strong to be killed. Outside the door, marked with his family sigil, an orange Sithil beast leaping over a 7-pointed star. Tal stopped and dried his eyes properly. He had to lead the family. He must not show them a crying boy, but a young chosen who was strong enough to help. That's what his father had said before he left. Tal, you must look after your mother, Gref, and Kusi while I'm gone. I'm depending on you. How could he have known how long he'd be gone? How could he have known how much those words would mean to Tal? Tal took several breaths, then entered the family quarters. In the outer room, an underfolk servant took his school tunic and helped Tal put on the flowing, orange-trimmed white robe he wore at home. Tal hardly noticed that it was a new servant, and a fairly clumsy one at that. Underfolk were assigned to families by the Deputy Luminor of the Orange Order. For some reason, since Tal's father had first gone away on his unexplained mission, their underfolk servants were constantly being removed and replaced by others who weren't as capable. Tal's mother, Grail, was where she had been for several months, confined to her bed, struck with some sort of wasting sickness that was beyond the healing powers of the Chosen's magic or medicine. The only things that helped her were light and warmth, so her bed had been moved into the family's sun chamber, a room where every inch of the walls and ceiling was covered in tiny sunstones. It was always bright there and very warm. In addition to the sunstones, the room had its own steam vent, filling it with hot, moist air from the castle's central heating pools far below. Tal went to his mother at once, striding through the antechamber so quickly that the 3 people there didn't have time to stand up and offer greetings, or get cross because Tal had failed to bow to his seniors and offer them light from his sunstone. Tal knew that they would complain later. Two of the three were Lalek and Korak, his mother's female cousins, and complaining about Tal was one of their favorite activities. He didn't know the third person, a man with broad orange stripes on his robe and a collar of mirror and sunstones, signifying high rank in the order. The spirit shadows of all three were quicker than their masters. They loomed up from the floor as Tal approached. His cousin's spirit shadows both had the shape of a tretch, quite a common inhabitant of Aenir. They each looked rather like a 7-foot-tall, grotesquely thin cross between a stick insect and a spider, complete with 8 legs and bulbous eyes. Tal thought that they were slightly more appealing than Lalek and Korak themselves. Tal didn't recognize the man-spirit shadow. It seemed very short and broad until it reared up. In the few seconds that it took to reach the door on the other side of the room, Tal caught a glimpse of something that had bent under the 9-foot ceiling and was roughly egg-shaped in the middle, with a rather lizard-like head, 4 legs, and a tail. Tal forgot about it as he went into the sun chamber. As expected, his mother was there. She had both Kusi, Tal's 3-year-old sister, and Gref, his 9-year-old brother, in bed with her, holding them tight. They had all been crying. Tal wished he could crawl in too, just for a moment's comfort. Grail's spirit shadow was under the bed, only its round, strangely blurred head visible. It had faded as Grail grew weak. Once it had been strong, taking the shape of a huge owl with great tufted eyebrows, and had been one of the few spirit shadows in the castle that could fly a long way from its master. Now it looked like a melted wax model of an owl, its shadow flash light and almost transparent even in the sun chamber. Grail was obviously very sick. Her skin was gray and sweating, and she had lost so much weight in her face that she had almost looked like someone else. Tal felt like crying again as he looked at her. He couldn't believe his father wasn't coming back, and his mother looked so close to death. Even the sunstone around her neck was going dark. It didn't flash as Tal raised his own and made his formal greeting. "I greet you, Mother," he said, and his sunstone brightened, giving her light, as was her due. Gotta love neighbors. Grail smiled a bit, but could not take an arm away from her other 2 children to raise her sunstone. "Tal," she said, her voice so soft that he had to come closer and crouch by the bed to hear her at all. "Tal, they said father isn't coming back," Tal said, his voice almost breaking. Gref and Kusi looked at him and started crying again. "Shush, children," Grail comforted them. "It is true your father has not yet returned, but that doesn't mean he is lost forever. I think he will come back in time, but until he does, we must all be brave. Can you be brave? For me? And for your father?" "Yes," said Tal, though he had to swallow as he said it. Graf and Kusi nodded, both unable to speak. "I need to speak to Tal alone," said Grail. "Graf, take Kusi out to Hutrin. She will give you orange cake and sweet water." Tal held Kusi down from the bed, her shadow guard slipping down first, so it would be ready to catch her if Tal slipped. The little girl seemed almost happy to be going to Hutrin and orange cake. Gudrun was one of the underfolk servant that managed to keep assigned to them for any length of time. She had been Gref's nurse and was now Kusi's. I want to stay, said Gref. I'm almost as old as Tal. No, you're not, exclaimed Tal. He was almost 5 years older. Can't you count? Gref, go with your sister, Grail said gently, as her spirit shadow gestured with one talon leg, reinforcing her command. Gref scowled at Tal, but went. Sit by me, Grail said. Tal, I do believe your father will come back to us, but we must decide what to do if he has not yet returned by the day of Ascension. Tal paused. He had been so concerned about the news and about his mother that he hadn't thought about himself. He would be 13 3/4 in 2 months, and shortly after that, on the day of Ascension, all the chosen would enter Aenir. Since he would have come of age, his shadow guard would be free, and he would have to find a creature of Aenir to bind as a spirit shadow. Tal had been preparing for that day for what seemed like forever. It would be his chance to bind a powerful spirit shadow, to show his strength and mastery of the light. Deep in his bones, he knew that his father had trained him well, and he had a natural gift. He would come back with a great and terrible spirit shadow. With its help, he would one day rise beyond the orange to the yellow or even the blue. Tal's parents had lifted the family 2 levels within orange. Tal would make sure that his own children would start from higher still. But Tal couldn't enter Aenir without the help of a primary sunstone. He'd never had to think about that in the past because his father had one and had used it to help the whole family enter Aenir. Now, with Redam gone, so was the primary sunstone, unless his mother had one. Haven't you got a primary sunstone? Tal asked, desperately hoping that they'd only used his father's sunstone for convenience. Most adult chosen's sunstones were primaries, strong enough to enter Aenir. Freya raised one very thin hand to her chest and touched the sunstone on the silver chain around her neck. It barely sparked as her finger touched. Once this was, she whispered. But now I shall need help too, and so will Gref and Kusi. You know what will happen if we cannot enter Aenir. Tal nodded. If he was unable to enter Aenir and bind a spirit shadow to himself, he would be separated from his family, demoted, not to just the next order down, the Red, but right out of the ranks of the Chosen. He would become one of the underfolk, a servant for the rest of his days. Worse than that, his mother's last chance of a cure would be lost. The spirit realm of Aenir was a place of magic and marvels, of creatures and beings that had wisdom as well as power. There, Grail might be cured, her life saved, if she could last until the day of Ascension. It was forbidden to enter Aenir before that day. I will have to get a new primary sunstone, said Tal, his voice wavering despite his obvious determination. For the family. Grail nodded and squeezed his hand, her touch as light as a faint breeze. Her eyes closed, and she seemed to slip away from Tal, her face slowly smoothing into sleep. I will get a primary sunstone, repeated Tal quietly. Somehow. Alright, that was chapter 1. Give me a moment, I'm going to drink some water. You guys doing alright? good chunk of the way into this book already. That's not bad. Hope you guys are doing okay and enjoying the read stream. We'll probably go for an hour and a half, maybe, to 2 hours, maybe, depending on how far we get, I think. Alright, Chapter 2. Tal sat by his mother for a long time, thinking of how he could get a new, powerful sunstone. He could think of only 3 ways, and all carried some risk. The first would be to ask his mother's cousins, Lalek and Korak. They were higher up in the Orange Order, rumored to be going yellow soon. They both wore several sunstones in their silver circlets, in the rings that flashed upon their fingers, even set in the points of their mirror-bright shoes. Tal thought they must have won them gambling. He'd never seen Lalek or Korak do anything else. But Lalek and Korak were not known for their generosity, and Tal thought that they particularly disliked him. He couldn't understand why, though when he was younger he had set up a bucket of ash to fall on them during doling the brilliance just before a family dinner. It had only been a joke, but they seemed to hold a grudge. Of course, it hadn't just been ash. Still, Tal thought, they were family, and they were just outside in the reception room, though that was probably only because everyone would expect them to come now that the news was out about Rarim's presumed death. Tal sighed. His shadow guard, catching his mood, changed shape from a 2-headed Corville to an almost normal shadow. It shivered and made a sort of throwing up motion before slipping back into the long cat-like shape of a Corville, though with only 1 head. It made Tal smile. Even his shadow guard disliked Lalek and Korak. This time, Tal stopped at the door and made the proper bow to his elders. He raised his sunstone and said, "I greet you, Korak, Lalek, and Shadow Master Sushin," said the unknown man, negligently erasing his own sunstone and rudely blasting a very bright white light into Tal's face. Korak and Lalek did the same, so Tal had to raise his hand to shield his eyes. The light grew brighter still, and Tal felt an unpleasant heat on his hand. The shadow guard let out a low whistle, so low only Tal could hear. Tal felt anger build inside him, as hot and bright as the light. His cousins and his unknown Shadow Master, a title that meant he served the Empress directly, in addition to his rank in the Orange Order, would never have dared treat him like this if his mother or father were around. The light disappeared, and Tal brought his hand down. None of the 3 had bothered to get up, but their spirit shadows had moved forward and were standing over Tal, unpleasantly close. The Shadow Master's, Tal realized, was a deep-water shell beast. It had a flat shell or a carapace that covered its middle. The Shadow Master was not impressed by your rudeness, said Lalek. Even under the circumstances, one must not forget the proper way to do things. I beg the Shadow Master's forgiveness, Tal said slowly, forcing the words out. May my light diminish no further in his eyes. The Shadow Master grunted. He looked like a pig, Tal thought. He had a fat face, ready to grub at any trough, like the pigs the underfolk herded in the farm caverns below. Take 3 deluminants, said the Shadow Master, picking 4 clear bracelets out of his sleeve pocket and throwing them to Tal. They landed on the ground, since Tal was too shocked to catch them. He bent to pick them up, slowly slipping each one over his hand onto his wrist. The luminants were visible punishments marking an offense against the order of the Empress. They could only be removed by someone higher than the person who'd given them in the first place. If Tal picked up 7 Deluminants, he would be demoted to the Red Order. 7 more after that, and he would be joining the Underfolk, even before the Day of Ascension. After putting on the 3rd bracelet, Tal stopped and looked at the Shadow Master. 3 Deluminants was a ridiculously harsh punishment for not greeting his superiors properly, but the Shadow Master had thrown 4. "There are 4 Deluminants, Shadow Master," he said, feeling his face flush with humiliation. He had never had more than a single Deluminant in his life. 3, 4, it doesn't matter, said Shadow Master. "Put it on, Tal. You must learn to pay proper respect." Slowly, Tal picked up the 4th Deluminant and slid it onto his wrist. The bracelets were made of crystal and jangled as they touched. "How can I serve my distinguished visitors?" Tal asked, following the proper ritual even though he wanted to pick up a jug of frosted sweet water and throw it in their faces. "I am the Shadow Master Sushin, Bright Star of the Orange Order and Spectral Adept," announced the fat man. "I have come to offer the Empress's sorrow at the death of your father." "He's not dead," Tal wanted to say, but he did not dare speak aloud. This Shadow Master seemed to want him to be disrespectful. He was even reaching into his sleeve pocket to jangle the Deluminants there, while he watched Tal struggle with his feelings. "We thank the Empress," said Tal. He didn't really understand what was going on. Why was his Shadow Master so hostile to him? He expected his cousins to be nasty, but this man was a stranger, a servant of the Empress. "That's it, really," said Sushin. He took a handful of dried shrimps out of his voluminous pocket and stuffed them into his mouth, still talking. "You may go back to the Lectorium now, Tal. Must keep up with your studies." Tal felt sick watching the huge wad of pink munched up shrimps churning about in Sushin's mouth. The man was a pig and a bully. Shrimps were his mother's favorite, and hard to come by since they were rarely trapped in the deep underground streams by the Underfolk. Tal had been trying to get her some for weeks without success. "I desire to ask a question of my mother's cousins, if I may," Tal said carefully. Despite the anger he felt at having to ask permission to speak in his own home, he had no choice. "Ask away," replied Sushin. He took another handful of shrimps and washed them down with a glass of sweet water, spilling it down the deep furrows where his bloated cheeks met his mouth. "Light shine on you, Shadow Master," said Tal, bowing again. He turned to his cousins, who were smiling, but not in a nice way. They seemed to be looking forward to something. Their spirit shadows jiggled in front of Tal, almost dancing, so he had to talk between them. "Mother is ill," he began, "and since Father is missing, we will need help to enter Aenir when the Day of Ascension comes. I ask your help as close cousins to my mother. Grant us a sunstone of sufficient power to be a primary stone." Lalek and Korak looked at each other, and their smiles grew wider. Then they looked at Sushin, and everyone smiled, except Tal. "Odo," said Lalek, fingering the 2 very large sunstones that flashed on her thumb and forefinger rings. "We really haven't any to spare." "What a shame," added Korak, lightly touching the pendant she wore that held 4 sunstones, all of them twice as large as Tal's own. But I'm sure you'll manage somehow, even though your father is dead. Tal stared at them, his fury growing. Dimly, he was aware of his shadow guard gripping him around the knees so he wouldn't charge forward. He gripped his own sunstone, wishing that he could throw light spears from it, or the rain of sparks, or any of the other combat magic that he had only just begun to learn in the Lectorium. Sushin broke the tension by shoveling the last of the shrimps into his mouth and pushing himself up out of the chair. Lalek and Korhek hastily jumped up as well. By rights, all 3 of them should have bowed to Tal as they were in his house, but they didn't. Sushin just walked out, followed by the 2 women. The spirit shadows backed away slowly. They knew, if their masters did not, that Tal was very close to some sort of crazy attack. When the underfolk servant closed the door behind them, the shadow guard let Tal go, his breathing starting to work again, and he could think. His first plan to get a sunstone had failed miserably. He would have to move on to the next plan, and he would have to try to find out why Shadow Master Sushin wanted him to fail. You see, Tal whispered to the door. He raised his arm and jangled the lumens. You'll see. I'll get my sunstone. His shadow guard grew an arm and shook it too, in a silent protest. It kept on after Tal stopped, and had to race to catch up with him as he went to see how Graf and Kusi were coping with the terrible news. And that is chapter 2. Let me drink a little bit more water. Reading, I forgot, is actually pretty hard, especially out loud. It really rips my throat up just to keep talking so long. It's actually worse than streaming. Because at least during streaming I can take breaks. I hope you guys are enjoying though. Alright. We will do one more chapter and then we're going to be ending stream. Alright? And I might play a little bit, but let me check the time. It's about 8:57. Depending on what time we're at after chapter 3, we're probably gonna stop. Because I want to do these at around an hour and a half each for each stream, so we can kind of keep the one book for a little while. I'll do probably one read stream every week or 2 a week, depending on things. Is that okay? I think that'll be okay. Yeah, I think that'll be okay. And you can always come back and watch them on YouTube, the full stream, or you can watch the singular videos, which I'm gonna upload. What's happening? Oh, I'm just taking a break between the chapters. This is gonna be our last chapter of stream, most likely. And we're probably gonna do, what's it called? We're probably gonna do 1 read stream per week or 2 per week, depending on things. this whole stream is going to be on the YouTube channel, and each chapter, or every 2 chapters, is going to be, thank you Big Smart, is going to be uploaded as a video for YouTube. So it'll have its own playlist for read streams and stuff. I'm also going to be doing a video, probably a pretty short one, for the Nightmares and Dreams stories. So look forward to that one. I'm going to be reading out the full story that I put out of the horror dream that I had a while back, so that's going to be its own video, probably, depending on like how it comes out in terms of time. But yeah, I hope you guys are enjoying the read stream at least. They're probably going to be shorter. I think they're all going to be very much shorter than normal streams, because this is actually pretty hard to do. To just keep talking. It's worse than like streaming because I don't talk as much during stream. So at work, just checking in. Hey, we're about to do the last chapter. Hope work's going okay. But hi Rappa, how are you? But yeah, this is gonna be the last chapter for tonight. I hope you guys are enjoying the story itself, though. This is one of my like favorite series, and I actually haven't gotten past volume 3. So when we get past there, it's all going to be completely new to me. I read this in high school a long time ago. So my favorite books, and I hope you guys are enjoying it. That's our cue to start up, because the fridge is now going to be silent for a little bit. Alrighty. But yeah, we'll be done in about probably like another 15 minutes or so, I would think. I don't know. But alright, let me start the recording. Chapter 3. Tal's second plan would have to wait for 7 days, when he could enter the next achievement of luminosity. While he waited, he tried very hard to be a model student. Whenever an idea for a practical joke came into his head, or he got bored as the assistant lector droned on about his recursive light or spectral shifting, the soft chink of the deluminance on his wrist would remind him to behave. Even with his best efforts, it was a hard week for Tal. After every evening meal, Kusi would forget and ask for her father to put her to bed. She cried when he didn't come, and was too young to understand that it wasn't because he didn't want to. Grail was too weak to get out of bed herself, so it had fallen to Tal to tuck the little girl in and tell her a story. He then had to make sure that Gref actually went to bed at all. It was all a constant reminder of his father's absence. Tal would lie awake at night, hoping that he would hear his father's footsteps outside his room, and his familiar voice asking him if all was well. Unfortunately, Tal was more likely to hear Gref's voice saying something like, "Tal, why don't I sneak over to Lalek's room and just steal a sunstone?" Or, "Tal, I bet I could drop a blanket on Korak and get her bracelet off and she wouldn't know who did it." Or Gref's most constant question, "Tal, why can't I help you get a new sunstone?" Kusi was not much better, in her own way. Besides having to read her a story, most nights he had to help her get back to sleep. She'd lie in bed looking up at him with her huge blue eyes and say, "I don't want Tal, I want Mummy." To make matters worse, Shadow Master Sushin seemed to have spread the word that Tal was to be picked on. Older Chosen, he had never seen before tried to get in his way and blame him for collision. Strange spirit shadows followed him so often he stopped using the smaller stairways. He even avoided the best shortcut in the castle, the Underfolk's laundry chute, a slippery slide that spiraled from the highest chambers of the Violet down to the Red, and then beneath to the Underfolk's work caverns. Tal didn't want to meet a spirit shadow in the laundry slide. Being in the slide was the closest you could get to real darkness in the castle. There were no sunstones inside. The only light came spilling in around the hatches on each of the 49 order levels. These faint lines of light were also the only way for the chute riders to know where they were, so they could push their feet out and bring themselves to a stop, usually with some damage to the soles of their shoes. So Tal kept to the main stairs and the colorless corridors, the wide passageways that were not part of the realm of any particular order. In the lectorium, they were taught that all might serve the Empress, that all the orders were like a family. Tal knew this was a load of shadow spit. The chosen in the lower orders were resentful of the higher ones, and the chosen of the higher orders liked putting everyone in their place. The children were the worst. If they caught Tal creeping about, they'd gang up to blind him with their sunstones, a blindness that sometimes took days to fully wear off. Tal just tried to avoid trouble. It was even more difficult because he had to look about Gref as well. His brother was in a different lectorium, and he hadn't complained to Tal about any problems. Still, Tal tried to keep an eye on him. Gref had a genius for trouble. He was very good at making it, and at avoiding responsibility for it. But even getting away with things 8 times out of 10 meant getting caught twice. Gref's genius did not serve him well when it came to being picked on. Tal wasn't so much worried about what might happen to Gref, but what his younger brother might do to take revenge. The case of the boy who had drawn a picture of Gref as a 2-headed tuppet was never far from Tal's mind. Gref had saved his allowance for 7 months, then paid a much older student to create a light puppet of himself as a truly vicious tuppet, which he'd managed to get into the other boy's room at night. The boy had woken up with a scream they could hear in all 7 towers. He still couldn't see a light puppet show without shaking nervously. Gref's glory hadn't lasted long. It was clear to the authorities where the light puppet had come from, with Gref's face on it. What worried Tal the most was that even after being punished, Gref said it was worth it, and he'd do it again. Luckily, he wasn't old enough to be given deluminance. All of this trouble was a constant worry for Tal, but it was nothing compared to the continuing absence of his father. He came back, everything would be all right. With every day that passed without him, Tal's secret fear that his father might really be dead grew stronger. He had to think harder about getting a primary sunstone. If only the horrible Lalek and Korek had just given him a sunstone, he wouldn't have to try to win an achievement of luminosity. The achievements of luminosity were held every quarter month, and were technically open to everyone who wished to demonstrate their skill and artistic abilities. It was rare for somebody who only had a shadow guard like Tal to participate. The achievements were divided into several categories, each held in different parts of the castle. While all achievements tested the participant's skill with a sunstone and sense of light, each category tested other specific talents and abilities as well. Tal had put his name down for the achievement of body. This achievement was essentially an obstacle course, where fitness and dexterity were as important as light control. It was held in the Hall of Mirrors, which added an extra level of difficulty. Light had to be tightly controlled there, because the slightest slip would mean thousands of embarrassing reflections. Over the week, Tal practiced on the course every afternoon after he finished at the lectorium. There were 7 obstacles, each of which had to be jumped, climbed, swung across, or crawled over. The ancient obstacles were made of solid light, a magic that was now lost to the Chosen, though some thought the Empress might know the secret ways. Participants could make the obstacle change into something else by directing a beam of light from their sunstone at exactly the right spot in exactly the right color. The secret to doing well at the achievement of body was to turn all the obstacles in front of yourself into something easy, like a gasping hole which could be jumped across. At the same time, you had to turn your competitors' obstacles into more difficult things, like a surprising wall. Sometimes obstacles flickered through multiple combinations right up until the last second, as light beams shot everywhere. It was not unknown for a gasping hole to become a surprising wall in the same instant that a competitor jumped, resulting in an unpleasant collision. Tal wasn't worried so much about that. Getting knocked out by smacking his head into a surprising wall or tripping over a sudden tunnel wasn't a problem. The audience would just laugh, but any disregard of the rules of light could lead to more deluminance, and Tal couldn't afford that. That won't happen, he muttered after another exhausting practice. The winner of the achievement was usually advanced several levels within his or her order, or was permitted to ask for a sunstone or some other reward instead. Tal intended to be the winner. He'd always been good at trial achievements, which all the children competed in. The practices were going well. What could go wrong? On the morning of the achievements of luminosity, Tal found out exactly what could go wrong. Nervous, he went to the Hall of Mirrors a good hour early and discovered that his name was not on the list for that day's achievement of body. It wasn't on the list for the next time either, or the one after that. But I wrote it down, Tal insisted, in the registry a week ago. The half-bright, who had the list for the achievement of body, shrugged. He was a low-ranking chosen of the Red Order, better than a dimmer, but not much above an underfolk, which was why he had an actual job. Most chosen didn't do anything so menial, devoting themselves to their hobbies or interests or in advancing themselves through achievements or the politics of the Empress's court. "You're not here," he said, holding up the huge leather-bound book. "Maybe you accidentally signed up for some other achievement." "I can't have," said Tal. His shadow guard shook its head too. "You'll have to go to the registry and check," said the half-bright. His spirit shadow was as lackluster as he was, a sick-legged animal of some kind that slept around his ankles. Tal nodded and sped away. Behind him, he heard the man snort something like, "Orange idiot." But Tal didn't look back. He remembered exactly what he'd signed up for. He couldn't have made a mistake. Unless he'd signed up for the wrong achievement. What if he'd signed up for the achievement of combat or the achievement of healing? He wasn't properly trained for either of those. He'd get the white ray of disgust from the audience for sure, and have his arms loaded with deluminance. He'd become an underfolk His mother would die, and Greffin Kusi would follow him down into the dark servant halls below the castle. I must not panic, Tal told himself. He stopped running and carefully bowed and gave light to a brilliance of the violet who passed by. He still had half an hour left. I must not panic, Tal repeated to himself, taking deliberate, slow breaths. He walked quickly toward the registry. Alright, that is going to be the end of chapter 3. And during next stream, we're going to start on chapter 4 and find out what happened with that registry. I hope you guys enjoyed stream. That's going to be about the end of stream. And for tonight, that's going to be the end of the 7th tower. Gonna set this down. It's shaping up to be a busy night. I'll be listening in as much as I can. Might have to dip out without notice. No worries, Rabbit. I hope your night gets a little better. I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. I hope you guys have a good rest of your sleep. Give you guys a little bit of ear rips here and there before we end stream, just to end it off. But yeah, I'm gonna be uploading those tomorrow. So tomorrow night, but the full stream will be up immediately after, both on obviously Twitch and on YouTube. So I hope you guys enjoyed. And overall, we're gonna be reading again probably this coming Friday. Most likely, we'll probably read again on Friday, or whatever night I have free for doing so. I'm probably going to be putting in an application for a job as a waiter, so. But I hope you guys enjoyed the stream, and I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. You guys have a great evening. Sleep tight.